What if a civilizational crisis was predictable and we knew when it would happen? That's exactly what authors Neil Howe and William Strauss suggest in their book, The Fourth Turning. To Howe and Strauss, the Western world has operated on cycles of 85 years, comprising 4 eras each lasting approximately 21 years. Each era has its own archetypal persona or mood, ushering in new social, political, economic climates in response to previous conditions. The ultimate climax of the cycle is crisis, from which the succeeding generation recovers by entering into the high. The theorists behind the fourth turning defined a generation as all people born within a roughly 21-year span, or similarly about one phase of life: childhood, 0 to 20, young adulthood, 20-40, middle-aged years, 40-60, and old age, 60 plus. While some view U.S. history as a succession of centuries or political waves, Strauss and Howe view it from the standpoint of Anglo-American generations stretching back to 1433. Doing a little math with a 21-year generation means we are now in the 29th generation since 1433, taking note, of course, that very few modern Americans' lineages will actually make it to an American ancestor that far. Over those 29 generations, we should have seen now some 7 major crises during every fourth generation. The particular alignment of the theory in early U.S. history is difficult to pin down, particularly because it is really British history. Beginning in the 1400s, the first major crisis, according to Neil Howe, is the War of the Roses. Moving forward in history, the next crises are the Armada Crisis, late 1500s, and Glorious Revolution, late 1600s. Another century forward brings an American audience to more familiar territory with the Revolutionary War, late 1700s. The rest are fairly easy to guess: the U.S. Civil War, 1859, and World War, Chow, 1940s, bringing us to a point of unease as we now appear due for another major crisis and war. There is at least enough evidence in the regular occurrence of crises in American history to warrant a deeper exploration. What brings us to the point of crisis roughly each century? The high. The first stage emerging after a fresh crisis is the high. It's during this time that citizens seek stability. The generations living, working, and possibly fighting during the past crisis know the depth to which society can decay and seek respite from chaos. People turn towards stronger institutions in government, law enforcement, and civil functions, but also typically in churches and communal organizations. Think of the post-Webido high, an American population relieved by the end of the Second Global War, but also invigorated by its victory returns with high trust in its governing powers and national identity. Strauss and Howe place this era as spanning from 1946 to 1963 in the current cycle. The cracks in this wave, however, are already understood. Minority voices, out of step with the majority's values in government and social organization, feel stifled by an overbearing political and social pressure. The awakening. The second era is that of the awakening, where personal autonomy begins to eclipse societal duty and its many expectations. Individual-minded movements, tired of social disciplines, attack the institutions in a bid to become more true to themselves. The institutions are believed to stifle individual creativity, spirituality, and bona fide culture. In our current wave, this is captured by the 1960s hippie culture and runs up through the tax revolts of the early 1980s. The unraveling in the third era, the unraveling, we reach the polar opposite of the first era, the high. Here, institutions are at their weakest, while individualism reigns supreme. The unraveling comes when society, after tasting the fruits of their individual liberties, desires to fully disengage from societal restrictions and seek only their individual fulfillment. The fourth turning places this era as beginning in the 1980s and ending shortly after the turn of the millennium. Now, cracks in the social functions are observed: increasing crime, culture wars, and social dysfunction that will mature in the last stage, the crisis. The crisis. This is the fourth turning, the era of destructive action, commonly marked by wars, revolutions, and political turmoil. Institutions are remade to defend against external threats to the nation, and individualism is again at odds with national interest. The last crisis in the U.S. began with the economic crash of 1929 and ended with WW2. The authors place this era as beginning in 2008 and ending sometime in the early 2030s. We'll return to this shortly, as this is where we are now. The archetypes. Another important part of the fourth turning's theory is how each generation dons the characteristics of a particular archetype, either that of the prophet, the nomad, the hero, or the artist. based on which two eras, their formative years, childhood through young adulthood, overlap. The archetype describes the common traits of the majority in a generation, including basic attitudes towards politics, values, culture, risk, and family. Living through two eras by their midlife stages, a generation gradually adopts an archetype in response to the first half of their life, which then guides societal actions and attitudes, leading into the third and fourth turnings of their lifetime, whether they be periods of strong institutions or strong individualism. Here are the four archetypes and their characteristics. The prophet archetype is brought about by a childhood within a high era, where community life is strong and there is a general consensus in society and its ordering. The last prophet generation was that of the baby boomers, 1943-1960. Nomad generations are born during an awakening era when individualism begins to attack institutions perceived as stifling social ideals and spiritual flourishing. The current nomad generation is Gen X, 1961-1981. This generational archetype is individualistic and pragmatic. Hero generations grow up in an unraveling when individualism rules the land. Millennials, 1982-2005, are the current hero archetype, harkening back to the GI generation that fought in WW II. If anyone is going to fight a war soon, it's the millennial generation. Artist generations are born during a crisis, as institutions are reborn and strengthened amid a wave of public consensus and ethics of personal sacrifice. Currently, those born from 2005 onward are the homeland generation under the artist archetype. Each of these archetypal generations is brought about by their early experiences. Strauss and Howe trace the various generations and their archetypes back to the late medieval era, finding the same patterns of characteristics in successive generations, depending on which eras occupied their childhood and young adult years. Where we are now, since 2005, we are firmly in the crisis phase. We've witnessed the 2008 economic recession, along with increasing financial hardship due to inflation and ballooning housing prices. In the early 2020s, COVID rocked the world biologically and politically. Political divides are higher now than ever over the past century. The political scene has become more contentious and violent, as politically motivated assassinations, attempts, and verbal support for violence are increasingly common. What this crisis era is missing, historically at least, is a war. However, if you include U.S. proxy support for Ukraine, the U.S. has further been involved, albeit remotely, in war with a near peer in Russia, while a Taiwan invasion threatens war with China. War is in the air, and the fourth turning isn't over. The previous crisis era ended in World War II, so it's not absurd, especially with all the warning signs today, that another world war might end our current era sometime by the early 2030s. Typical of a crisis, our institutions are already undergoing renovation. The current U.S. administration is progressing with a strong agenda for federal cuts, reform, and restructuring. At the governmental level, the U.S. is aiming to restore trust in its institutions. The desire for stronger institutions in response to the current chaos may not stop at the government either. More fundamentally, the institutions of marriage, family, and church have been denigrated over the past several decades, and the hero archetype will likely work to restore these institutions as we enter a new high era after the current crisis. As the 2030s progress, millennials will increasingly take the reins of society and rebuild its institutions for a more coherent cultural order. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe for more, and comment down below where you see us headed in the four eras of the fourth turning. Until next time.